Prince accidentally heard his fiancée's secret, minutes before the wedding, and what he did next was. Before we begin this beautiful period romance story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing where you're joining me from. The bells of Windsor had been ringing since early morning, and it seemed to Margaret that they rang inside her skull as well. Her maid, Clara, fussed with the last row of tiny buttons along the back of the ivory gown. Pins glinted between Clara's lips, silk rustled, voices murmured, and every sound in the chamber pressed upon Margaret's nerves. "Stand a little straighter, my lady," Clara pleaded around the pins. "Her Majesty will be here at any moment to send her blessing." "I am standing straight," Margaret answered, though her shoulders had fallen again. She pulled them back at once. "There. Is that better?" "Much better," came her mother's cool voice from the chaise near the hearth. "You must remember, Margaret, the eyes of the world will be upon you. There is nothing more cruel than a crowd searching for a flaw." Margaret turned. The Countess Ashford sat perfectly composed, gloved hands folded, her own gown shimmering with discreet refinement. Not a hair was out of place, not a line of worry on her face. Only the faint tightening at the corners of her mouth betrayed how much this day cost her. "I shall do my best not to stagger or faint," Margaret replied, trying for a lightness she did not feel. "If I trip on the carpet, Mamma, will that send the Empire into decline?" Her mother did not smile. "You will not trip," the Countess said. "You have been taught to walk since you were old enough to stand. You have been taught to curtsy, to speak, to sit and to rise. Today you have only to remember what has been drilled into you for years. The Prince has done you the grace of choosing you. Do not dishonor that choice by carelessness." Behind her, Margaret's father paced near the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed on the manicured lawns beyond. He had been pacing since dawn. Every now and then he cleared his throat as if preparing to speak, and every time he said nothing at all. "In truth," he muttered now, "it is the making of us, the making of all of us." Margaret heard the words and felt them settle heavily upon her shoulders like another layer of fabric. The making of us. As if she were mortar and stone, Clara fastened the last button and stepped back. "There, my lady. You look—" She hesitated, then whispered, "You look like a queen." Margaret turned back to the mirror. The girl in the glass was tall and slender, the line of her neck graceful beneath the veil of tulle that would later be drawn over her face. Her hair, a glossy dark brown, had been arranged into a coronet of braids to support the small tiara sent from the royal treasury. The gown was elegant rather than extravagant, the silk falling smoothly, the lace at the sleeves delicate and restrained. She looked, she thought, like someone else entirely. There was a knock at the door. A lady-in-waiting entered, curtsied, delivered a message from the Queen's private secretary, and departed with efficient swiftness. "Well?" her mother asked. "The Queen sends her blessing," Margaret replied automatically. "Her Majesty requests that I remember I am to be the example for all young ladies in the kingdom." Her father gave a short, nervous laugh. "There, you see," he said. "The Queen herself." He broke off, turning away again. His shoulders sagged for a moment, then straightened as if he had remembered he must look proud for anyone who might enter. Margaret's throat tightened. She felt Clara's fingers fuss at the veil, but the room was beginning to crowd her, the air growing thin. "May I have a moment, Mamma?" she asked. "Just a few minutes alone." Her mother's brows drew together. "We scarcely have time, Margaret. The procession is to begin shortly." "A moment will not undo the schedule of the court," Margaret said softly. "I only wish to breathe before I walk into a chapel full of strangers staring at my every step." Her father glanced at the clock, and then at her face. There was something helpless in his eyes, something she had seen more and more often these last years. "Let her have her moment, Edith," he said to his wife. "5 minutes will do no harm." The Countess hesitated, then inclined her head. "Very well. But do not disturb the arrangement of your gown or veil. If you begin to weep, have Clara repair your face at once." "I shall do my best not to dissolve entirely," Margaret said, managing a small smile. Her parents left with the lady-in-waiting. Clara gathered the scattered pins and ribbons, bobbed a curtsy and slipped out after them, closing the door. The sudden quiet made Margaret's ears ring more than the bells. She crossed the room on careful feet and opened the inner door that led to a narrow antechamber, a small space joining her apartments to the long gallery beyond. It was nothing more than a square of polished floor, a chair, and a tall window. She stepped inside, leaving the door behind her not quite closed. The faint murmur of servants still reached her, but more distantly. The light from the window fell across the front of her gown, catching on the smooth silk. She laid her hands lightly against the frame and looked out. Carriages were arriving in a steady stream below, gliding up to the steps. Gentlemen in uniforms and black coats, ladies in bright gowns and feathers, foreign dignitaries, bishops in purple and white, everything in its place. Everyone knowing exactly where to go, what to say, how to move, all except her. "Margaret!" The familiar voice came from behind her. She turned quickly. Lady Agnes Harrow had slipped through the door, closing it almost but not entirely behind her. Agnes was in pale blue, her fair hair arranged more simply than the other ladies of the court. There was colour in her cheeks and concern in her eyes. "I thought you might need someone to remind you to breathe," Agnes said, coming to her. "The corridor outside is a nest of nerves." Margaret let out a shaky laugh. "I am not certain anyone can teach me to breathe today." Agnes took her hands. "Then I shall stand here and count for you. In, out, like a nurse with a child." "Do not speak of children," Margaret said, half joking, half near tears. "They will begin to ask for an heir the moment the vows are spoken." "They were asking already last week," Agnes replied, rolling her eyes. "The Dowager Duchess of Wexham has calculated how old she will be when your eldest son marries her youngest granddaughter." Margaret groaned softly. "You see, I am no longer a woman. I am a vessel for the future." Agnes squeezed her fingers. "You are Margaret Ashford. Even as future queen, you will still be you." "Will I?" Margaret thought. "Or will I disappear entirely beneath the crown?" Agnes stepped back, studying her face. "You look pale, but very dignified. How does your heart feel?" Margaret hesitated. The safe answer sat on her tongue. "It feels honoured, content, grateful." The phrases she had rehearsed for so long, but Agnes's eyes were too kind, too searching. "Unsteady," Margaret whispered. "As if someone has bent a bow inside my chest and drawn it back as far as it may go." Agnes's expression turned more serious. "Is it only nerves? Or is it more?" Margaret glanced at the door. It was closed, but sound sometimes slid under doors in these old places. She reached out, turned the key, and then thought better of it. If anyone tried the handle and found it locked, there would be questions. Instead, she left it as it was, only slightly ajar, and stepped farther into the room with Agnes, lowering her voice. "Do you ever think," she said, "how simple life might have been had we been born daughters of merchants or of country attorneys, or of respectable clergymen?" Agnes smiled faintly. "I suspect I should have found something to fret about even then. I can worry over the monogram on a handkerchief, but yes, I suppose it might have been simpler. For me," Margaret said, "it would have been kinder. No one would expect me to save anyone." Agnes's brow furrowed. "Margaret—" "My parents," Margaret went on, the words spilling faster now that she had allowed them to start, "speak of this marriage as if it were a miracle, as if the prince himself descended like an angel to rescue the Ashford name. They forget the bells have not only rung for me today, they have rung for the end of their fears." Agnes's eyes softened. "You know I understand something of it. My father's estates are not what they were. We all watch the ledgers and pretend not to. But the prince chose you, Margaret. No one dragged him to your door." Margaret gave a short, bitter laugh. "He chose the idea of me, the well-bred daughter of a respectable earl. He chose my manners and my breeding, and perhaps my smile. He did not know, when he first visited Ashford House, that the carpets had been mended 3 times and the silver sold to pay the butcher. He did not know my father spent nights at his desk with his head in his hands. Perhaps not at first," Agnes said gently. "But he knows now that your family is not wealthy as once. He is not blind." Margaret shook her head. "It is not only that. Agnes, do you remember 2 summers ago, before any of this began, before the prince ever looked at me twice? I remember you were much less plagued by ladies-in-waiting," Agnes said, "and you did not have a tiara in your hair." "There was someone," Margaret said in a low voice. "Before." Agnes's eyes widened. "Someone? Do not look so shocked. I was not reckless. There were no promises in dark gardens or letters tucked in boots. At least not at first," she swallowed. He was the younger son of a neighbouring gentleman in the country, Thomas Hale. You saw him once, I think, at Ashford, when we were 19. He was unremarkable to most. A little too quiet, perhaps. Too inclined to look at a book instead of at people. Agnes frowned slightly, thinking. Tall, with brown hair that would not lie flat. He asked me whether I had read some poet whose name I could not pronounce. That is the one, Margaret said, and despite everything a small smile touched her lips. He was kind and earnest. He had opinions about the poor in the village and about schools for the children. He would walk for hours simply to speak to the curate about a sermon. He had no title, no great fortune, only a modest portion he would inherit from a great uncle in time. Agnes regarded her closely. And you cared for him? I told myself I did not, Margaret replied. I told myself it was childish, that I could not attach myself to a man who would likely end in some obscure living, writing letters to newspapers about agricultural reform. But when I thought of the future, it was his voice I heard speaking to me over the breakfast table. His hands I imagined handing me a cup of tea. It was his kindness that seemed to fill the days, like sunlight. Agnes's voice was almost a whisper. Did he speak to you? He asked if I could ever be happy in a small parsonage, Margaret said. He did not say the words precisely, but they lay between us like a path. And I... She closed her eyes for a moment. I told him I had a duty to my family, that I could not indulge such dreams. I did not say no nor yes, I said we must be sensible. And then your father's debts worsened, Agnes said softly. Yes, the letters from the creditors grew sharper. Mamma spoke more often of economies. The visits to London grew more infrequent. Papa went to town for meetings and came back looking 10 years older. Margaret's voice dropped lower. And when the prince first asked me to dance, Mamma wept with relief. Not because she believed I would be loved, but because she believed we would be rescued. Agnes's fingers tightened around hers. Margaret, you do not blame them entirely, do you? Times are hard. They were frightened. I know they were frightened, Margaret said. I was frightened as well. But you must know the whole of it, Agnes, or I shall feel I'm standing at that altar under false colours. Agnes nodded once. Tell me, when the prince's courtship became serious, Margaret said, when everyone began to whisper that the match was likely, I panicked. I thought of Thomas, of his quiet insistence that a life founded on truth, however humble, was better than any glittering falsehood. I thought of the way my parents looked at me as though I were a piece of property to be bargained. I felt as though the walls of Ashford were closing in. She moved to the window again, her hands knotting together. I wrote a letter, Agnes's breath caught. To whom? To a lady I had met during a visit to Paris, a friend of Mamma's, though more independent in her views. She was connected to certain circles abroad where marriages are sometimes arranged differently, where political alliances and personal attachments tangle in ways our society does not entirely approve. She gave a strained smile. I thought her worldly. I thought her clever. And in this letter, Agnes asked slowly, what did you say? I said, Margaret replied, each word costing her, that I was on the verge of accepting an offer from the Prince of Wales. I said I did not love him, and that my parents were pressing me forward. I said I believed I might yet find some way to break the engagement without too much noise, if only I could be assured of some other escape. Another match, perhaps abroad. Some place where my disobedience would be less ruinous. I hinted, I did not state, but I hinted, that I might be willing to let certain matters slip, to speak carelessly of court opinions, of people, that I could be useful. Agnes's hand flew to her mouth. Margaret, I was desperate, Margaret whispered. Foolish and desperate. I wrote as if I were a character in a novel, standing at the crossroads of fate. I thought only of myself and of Thomas, and of the crushing weight upon my parents' shoulders. I did not think of the implications, of how such words, if ever read by the wrong eyes, could be construed as something base, disloyal. I sealed the letter and gave it to a servant to send with the diplomatic pouch that was leaving the next day. And then? Agnes asked. And then, Margaret said, I lay awake all night imagining what I had done. I saw my father's face if anyone accused his daughter of scheming. I saw the Queen's disappointment. I saw the Prince's eyes, and we had scarcely spoken twice. I rose at dawn, went to the servant entrusted with the pouch, and demanded the letter back on some pretext. I burned it in the grate in my room, every line, every word. I watched it curl and blacken and vanish. Agnes let out a long, shaky breath. So the letter no longer exists? No. Margaret shook her head firmly. There is nothing left of it but ashes and my shame. The lady in Paris never received a word. She wrote later, inquiring kindly why I had fallen silent. I replied that circumstances had changed, and then very soon they did. Agnes studied her face. You accepted the prince? Yes, Margaret said. After I had destroyed the letter, after I had made myself understand that there was no honorable way to escape, I accepted. I told myself it was my duty, and that to refuse would be childish. I told myself that affection could grow, that respect might in time become more. And has it? Agnes asked quietly. Margaret turned back from the window, and for the first time that morning her expression warmed. Yes, she said simply, it has. You have seen him, Agnes, when he visits the hospitals, when he speaks to the veterans, when he listens to some timid clergyman muttering about the poor. He is not the frivolous creature the newspapers carve from rumour. He is thoughtful. He asks questions. He forgets to eat when he is reading a memorandum about coal miners. He remembers the names of the footmen. He sits with me in the evenings and speaks of schools and factories and laws, and he listens when I say what I have seen in the country. She smiled faintly. He laughs when I jest. He apologizes when he has been careless. He is good. And somewhere along the way, while I was busy mastering my curtsy and my smile, I discovered that I wanted his happiness more than I wanted my own comfort, that I minded his frown more than my mother's scolding. I came to love him, Agnes. Not as one loves a fairy tale, but as one loves a man one has watched trying to be better than he was yesterday. Agnes's eyes shone. Then why do you tremble so? Because, Margaret said, her voice breaking, none of that changes the beginning. If he knew that at first I saw him as a lifeline rather than as a beloved, if he knew that I once wrote words that could be twisted into treachery, if he knew that I had ever weighed his proposal against the memory of another man, how could he bear it? He believes, I think, that I have always been devoted. He believes my modesty, my reserve are virtues, not barricades. If he knew the truth, he would despise me. Agnes moved closer and took her by the shoulders. Listen to me. You destroyed the letter. You did not carry the scheme forward. You chose to remain. You chose to give your heart honestly in time. You were frightened and unwise, yes, but you were not wicked. Intention matters, Margaret whispered. If someone found out, if that lady in Paris spoke to the wrong person of our correspondence, if anyone ever hinted that the future queen had once contemplated breaking her engagement for the sake of a more convenient escape, it would stain him, not only me but him. The prince cannot be tied to someone whose name carries even the faintest breath of scandal. And yet, Agnes said softly, he is about to stand beside you, in front of God and everyone, and give you his name. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. That is why I cannot speak. That is why I must swallow it all and smile. My parents have pinned their survival upon this day. The court expects perfection. The queen expects obedience. He expects devotion. I cannot shatter everything with the truth. Agnes hesitated. And Thomas? Thomas is gone, Margaret said firmly, though something in her chest flinched. He left for a position in the north. We have not corresponded in a year. He belongs to a life I chose not to live. I shall not turn my head backward at the altar. I shall not. Agnes looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Very well. Then this is how it stands. You began in fear and folly. You continue in love and remorse. Perhaps that is the only way most of us ever learn. Margaret let out a breath that was almost a laugh. You make it sound almost noble. You are not noble for having erred, Agnes said dryly. You are noble for being sorry and for wanting to be better. That at least you share with him. Margaret glanced at the door again. If only he never hears of any of it. If only that letter remains nothing more than a mistake, burned to smoke. If only no one ever whispers to him that his bride once spoke of another man as the one she truly loved. On the other side of the antechamber wall, down a narrow, half-lit passage where portraits stared from the shadows, a man had stopped walking when he heard his own title spoken. The Prince of Wales had been escaping as well. An equerry had been chattering in his ear about the order of processions and the placement of foreign delegations, until Edward felt he would sooner face a regiment than another list of princes with unpronounceable names. He had dismissed the man with a polite word and ducked through a side door he knew well into the service passage that ran behind the great gallery. He had meant only to take a moment, to breathe without anyone watching him, without his mother's steady gaze or his uncle's jovial counsels of, "Do not stumble, my boy." He had paused by a narrow door standing slightly ajar, intending to pass quietly by. Then he heard Margaret's voice. The future queen had once contemplated breaking her engagement for the sake of a more convenient escape. He froze. The words slit into his thoughts like a knife into fabric. He should have moved on at once. He knew it, even as he leaned closer, drawn by a mixture of fear and disbelief. The door stood open a finger's breadth. Sound slipped easily through. He saw only a sliver of the room beyond, a slice of window, the edge of a chair. He could not see either woman, but their voices came clear. "My parents have pinned their survival upon this day," Margaret was saying. "The court expects perfection. The Queen expects obedience. He expects devotion. I cannot shatter everything with the truth." Edward's heart began to pound. A faint roar filled his ears. Agnes spoke next. "And Thomas?" "Thomas is gone," Margaret replied. "He left for a position in the north. We have not corresponded in a year. He belongs to a life I chose not to live. I shall not turn my head backward at the altar. I shall not." The name meant nothing to Edward, but the tone did. It was the sound of someone speaking of a wound, carefully bound, but not forgotten. Agnes's question reached him clearly. "Did you care for him?" "I told myself I did not," Margaret said. "But when I thought of the future, it was his voice I heard, not the prince's. When I imagined a life of my own, it was his kindness I saw. He was the one I truly loved, then." The last word came after a brief pause, soft but distinct. Edward's stomach clenched. The passage seemed suddenly narrower, the air thinner. He had believed, perhaps foolishly, that while their match had political advantages, there had also been something more personal that drew her. The way she smiled, quietly, when he spoke of matters that moved him. The way her eyes grew thoughtful when he asked her views. He had imagined that somewhere beneath the formality and the obligation there was affection, perhaps even love. Love beginning, at least. To hear her now speaking of another as the one she truly loved, even in the past tense, was like finding a hidden draught sneaking under a door he had thought sealed. And then came the words that rooted him to the spot. "I wrote a letter," she said. "To whom?" Agnes asked. "To a lady in Paris. I said that I did not love him, that my parents were pressing me. I said I believed I might yet break the engagement if I had some other escape. I hinted that I might be willing to say things that would be valuable, things heard at court, opinions, secrets. I sounded like some foolish heroine in a bad novel, ready to barter her position. I was shameless, Agnes." Edward's hand closed slowly on the edge of the doorframe. The wood creaked faintly under his fingers. He could not breathe for a moment. The light in the narrow passage dimmed. He heard Margaret's voice continue, urgent and low. "I did not think then of what such a letter might mean. I only wanted a door to open somewhere else. I burned it the next morning once my senses returned. I have never done anything like it since, but the fact remains that I wrote it, that I was capable of such selfishness." Agnes's voice was hushed. "But it is gone." "Yes," Margaret said. "Gone. Yet I shall never forget that I once weighed the prince himself, against my own escape, that I once saw him as nothing more than a means to save my family. If he knew Agnes, he would, quite rightly, cast me off." Edward did not hear Agnes's answer. The words he had already heard crashed against one another in his skull. Did not love him. Pressed by her parents. Break the engagement. Another escape. Willing to say things, valuable things. The one she truly loved. He saw in sudden vicious clarity the last 2 years unfold again, in reverse. Every look from her mother. Every desperate courtesy from her father. Every carefully arranged meeting. He saw himself smiling, convinced that her quietness was a form of modest affection. He saw her in the garden, her hand on his arm, listening intently as he spoke of reforms. Had she, even then, been measuring him as a ladder out of a burning house. The idea of treachery, in the sense his ministers would give the word, struck him only dimly. He did not believe, even now, that she would sell secrets to foreign powers. The woman he had come to know did not fit that shadow. But the knowledge that she had been willing to hint at it, in a moment of panic, to dangle the possibility before someone as a lure, that she had been capable of such a thought at all. His throat tightened. The trust he had not known he was building cracked like thin glass. The bells outside boomed another peal, shaking the air. The sound reminded him brutally of where he was meant to be, of the chapel filling with people, the Queen already seated, the clergy ready, the organist waiting. "Your Royal Highness?" The voice came from the other end of the passage. Edward jerked away from the door, his hand dropping. The equerry he had dismissed earlier stood there, looking apologetic and anxious. "Forgive me, sir," the man said. "They are asking for you in the sacristy. The procession must begin in a few minutes. Her Majesty is already in her place." Edward straightened with an effort, forcing his face into something resembling composure. "Of course," he said. His own voice sounded distant to him. "I lost my way in this rabbit warren. Lead on." The equerry smiled, relieved, and turned back toward the main corridor. Edward cast one last glance at the narrow door. Through the crack he could see nothing now but a slant of light on the floor. He did not know whether to fling the door open and confront Margaret at once, to demand explanation, confession, anything. He did not know whether to walk away and pretend he had heard nothing, to bury it under duty and ceremony. Both choices felt like tearing something vital. He followed the equerry in silence, his mind racing. The passage widened into the main hallway. Servants bowed as he passed. A pair of guards snapped to attention. A footman opened a door to another small chamber, where the Archbishop waited, along with a handful of court officials who all turned and smiled and murmured words he did not catch. Someone adjusted the fall of his robe. Someone else straightened the chain across his chest. A page offered him a glass of water. He shook his head. His mouth was dry, but he could not swallow. The organ began to play the first solemn strains in the chapel beyond. The sound rolled through the stone like thunder. "Your Royal Highness," the Archbishop said, beaming. "Are you prepared?" Prepared. The word rang strangely. Edward stood very still, seeing not the old man's kindly face, but Margaret at the window, her hands twisted together, speaking of another man's voice at her breakfast table, speaking of him, Edward, as an escape, a lifeline, a ladder. He had believed he would walk down the aisle today with a peaceful heart, perhaps a little nervous, perhaps a little humbled, but sure of the woman beside him. Now he felt as though the floor beneath his feet might give way at any step. The master of the household appeared in the doorway. "All is ready, sir. We await only your command to begin." Edward's gaze drifted to the small side door that led directly into the chapel, to the place where he would stand before the whole of England and promise to love and honor a woman whose first impulse had been to use him and flee. The music swelled. The bells thundered. The court waited. Edward, still reeling, must decide in the next breath whether to walk to the altar as if nothing has changed, or not appear at all. The silence stretched until it felt like a living thing between them. Edward stood as if rooted, every muscle taut. The Archbishop looked faintly puzzled. The master of the household shifted, his hand still on the door. "Sir," the master ventured, "shall we begin?" Edward opened his mouth and found that no sound came out. He closed it again, drew a breath that scraped his lungs, and heard his own voice at last. "One moment more," he said. "I should like a few minutes alone. Before I go in." The Archbishop's brows rose. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. Her man has a right to gather his thoughts before such a sacrament." The master of the household looked as if he wished to protest, but he bowed instead. "Shall I tell them, sir?" "Tell them," Edward said carefully, "that their prince asks the indulgence of his guests for a brief delay. The Queen will understand." "Yes, sir." The man bowed and withdrew. The others melted away with him. In a few moments, Edward found himself alone in the small sacristy. The faint murmur of the waiting congregation seeped through the stone. He pressed his hands on the back of a wooden chair, staring at the patterned tiles on the floor. Margaret's words looped through his mind, relentless. "The one I truly loved, then. I did not love him. I was being pressed. I might break the engagement if there were some other escape. His stomach twisted. He had not known, until this moment, how much he had believed in the purity of her feelings. The realization that he had been walking toward the altar with a dream instead of a certainty made him feel foolish and oddly young. A door opened quietly behind him. Edward. It was his mother. The Queen slipped into the room, closing the door behind her. She wore silver-grey satin and diamonds, her bearing as calm as if she were entering a drawing room instead of a room vibrating with her son's turmoil. "The master tells me you asked for a delay," she said. "The congregation is patient, but such departures from order create questions. Is something wrong?" He did not turn right away. When he did, his face was controlled, but his eyes gave him away. The Queen's gaze sharpened. "What has happened?" she asked. "I overheard something," he said. His voice was flat. "Not a moment ago, in one of the side passages." Her expression did not change, but the air between them seemed to tighten. "Something concerning the kingdom?" she asked. "Or your bride?" He gave a short, humorless sound that might have been a laugh. "Both, in a fashion." "Edward," she said quietly, "you are about to be married in front of half the crowned heads of Europe. If there is anything that could imperil more than your pride, you must tell me." He looked at her for a long moment. He had always known his mother to be wise, but he also knew how deeply she cared for appearances, for stability, for the image of the monarchy. "If I tell you," he said, "you will tell me to proceed." "Not if proceeding would be unjust," she replied, "or dangerous." He walked a short, restless arc from the chair to the wall and back again. "She did not love me," he said abruptly. "At the beginning. I suppose I always suspected duty had its hand in it. I did not begrudge it. None of us marry as common men and women do. But it seems I was more a lifeline to her family than anything else." She was pressed. The Queen's face remained composed, but a slight sadness touched her eyes. "Many are in one way or another." "That is not the worst," Edward said. "She spoke of another man, someone she truly loved once. Thomas. A quiet country gentleman by the sound of it. She spoke as though she had left her heart with him and handed me only what was left." "And now?" his mother asked. "Did she speak of now?" He hesitated. "She said she loves me now. That affection grew. That she admires my character." He could not keep a trace of bitterness from the last word. "But knowing how it began, knowing that when I was first certain of her, she was still weighing her heart against another," the Queen stepped closer. "You always knew this would not be a simple romance," she said gently. "You have duties. So does she. Hearts do not always begin where vows do." "What else did you hear?" He looked away. "She wrote a letter," he said. "To someone abroad. When she was first pressed to accept me. In it she spoke of breaking the engagement if she could find another way out. She hinted that she might be willing to use what she heard at court, to say things that would be valuable. Not because she wished to betray me, she said, but because she was desperate to escape. She burned the letter the next morning. She has done nothing like it since." His mother's fingers tightened around the small book she carried. That, more than anything, told him she was shaken. "She was frightened," the Queen said slowly, "and foolish, very much a girl." "Yes," he said, "but I am the Prince of Wales. A frightened girl with my name in her mouth can do much harm. Even if she repents, the fact remains that she was willing to think of me as a ladder to be climbed or thrown away." The Queen was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her tone was very controlled. "Do you believe she would do such a thing now?" she asked. "As she is today in this gown about to become your wife?" He thought of Margaret listening to sick veterans in the hospital, of the way she had argued with him about a proposed law because she thought it would fall harshly on tenant farmers, of the way her eyes lit when he admitted he had been wrong on some small matter and amended his opinion. "No," he said at last, and the word came out rough. "I do not believe she would. I believe she regrets it. I believe she is ashamed. But I also believe that trust is not built upon what might have been, but upon what was." The Queen's gaze softened. "You have always had a strong sense of honor," she said. "Stronger than many men twice your age. That is both a gift and a burden. Consider this, Edward. The Crown requires you at times to accept that human beings are frail, but capable of growing better. If you demand perfection at the beginning of every relationship, you will find yourself very alone." He set his jaw. You would have me go on as if nothing has changed. I would have you decide whether your pride has been wounded or your safety, and your country's, she replied. If you truly believe this young woman is a danger, that she is false to her core, then you must not marry her. I will bear the scandal if I must. But if she was a frightened girl who wrote a foolish letter and burned it, and if she has grown into a woman who loves you honestly, then you must ask yourself whether you will punish her forever for the girl she was. He looked at her sharply. You speak as if you know something of such decisions. She smiled faintly. Every long marriage begins somewhere imperfect, she said, even royal ones. There are things you learn only after you have said yes, not before. The question is whether you can walk into that chapel and say yes knowing what you now know, without bitterness. He rubbed his forehead. The organ's notes thrummed faintly through the walls, reminding him with every chord that time was slipping by. I cannot stand at that altar with this between us, he said, not unspoken. I would look at her and see those words over and over. I must know what she will say when she stands before me with full knowledge that I have heard. You wish to confront her, the Queen said. Yes. She studied him for a moment, then nodded once. Very well. I will have her brought to you. But you must remember, Edward, that any words spoken now will be spoken under immense strain. Be just, but be merciful. She is not your subject today. She is the woman who may be your wife. I do not know if I can be both, he said. Then try to be a man first, and a prince second, she replied. The crown will wait the space of a conversation. She moved to the door, paused, and looked back at him. Whatever you decide, she said, I will stand beside you, but decide as a man who must live with his own heart, not as a statue on a throne. When she had gone, the room felt colder. He stood alone again, gripping the back of the chair, waiting for the door to open once more, this time with Margaret on the other side. In another part of the castle, Margaret sat very still, while Clara blotted at her forehead with a powder puff. How long has it been? She asked. Clara glanced at the clock and bit her lip. Nearly 20 minutes, my lady. 20, Margaret repeated. They planned the procession to the minute. The Queen does not tolerate delays. Outside the robing chamber, the sounds of movement and muffled voices grew and swelled. Once or twice the door opened as someone poked in their head, only to withdraw quickly with murmured apologies. Her mother paced now, something she rarely allowed herself to do. Her father had abandoned the window to stand by the mantel, his fingers worrying at the edge of a porcelain figurine. This is intolerable, the Countess said. They cannot leave us in ignorance. There must be some explanation. Have you done anything foolish, Margaret? The question struck like a slap. No, Mamma, Margaret said more sharply than she intended. I have been here, scarcely breathing, while you and Clara arrange my veil. I have not had an opportunity to elope or set fire to the castle. This is no time for wit, her mother snapped. You are pale as death. If you faint on the way to the altar, it will be because you worked yourself into some state. Mamma, Margaret's father said, she has done nothing. Do not add to her distress. It is my duty to ensure she does not falter, the Countess said. If the prince should take alarm at some sign of hysteria. An unwelcome thought slithered into Margaret's mind. Do you think, she said slowly, that the delay is because of me? Because they fear I may change my mind? Nonsense, her father said at once, but he did not quite meet her eyes. The prince is sensible. He understands nerves. He is likely conferring with the archbishop about some point of order. The door opened then with a sharp little click. The master of ceremonies himself entered, followed by a royal equerry. His face was composed, but he smoothed his sleeves more than was his habit. Lord and Lady Ashford, Lady Margaret, he said with a bow. I bring the prince's apologies for the delay. His Royal Highness has requested a few extra moments for private reflection before the ceremony begins. Margaret's heart lurched. Reflection, she repeated. It is a solemn day, the man said smoothly. A man does not pledge his life lightly. I assure you, Lady Margaret, all is proceeding. We ask only your continued patience. Her mother's smile reappeared, thin and fixed. Of course. The prince's sensibilities do him honor. Her father, however, was watching Margaret. He saw the way her fingers twisted in her lap, the way her throat moved as she swallowed. Is he well? Margaret asked. He is not ill. As well as any man on his wedding day, the equerry said with a dry little chuckle. I assure you, my lady, If there were any cause for alarm, I would not be sent alone. They bowed and withdrew. The door closed again. The room felt smaller than before. Margaret stared at the empty space they had left. "Private reflection," she murmured. Clara moved to adjust the veil again. "It is romantic in a way, my lady," she said timidly. "A prince taking time to think before binding himself forever. It means he takes it seriously." Margaret forced herself to nod. Yes, perhaps. But a weight had settled in her chest. Something was wrong. It might be nothing, she told herself. It might be as innocent as a prayer or a word with the Archbishop. Yet the phrase private reflection echoed in her mind like a verdict. Her mother resumed her pacing. "He cannot leave us to sit and wither," she said. "The guests will begin to whisper." "They are already whispering," Margaret said more quietly than before. "They will be counting the minutes. They will think it is I who have delayed." "Nonsense," her mother repeated, though less firmly. "No one will blame you." Margaret knew better. She knew how the world worked. If a prince hesitated, there would be a dozen charitable explanations. If a bride faltered, there would be only one. Weakness. She thought of Agnes's words in the antechamber. You began in fear and folly. You continue in love and remorse. The knowledge sat in her like a stone. After another long 10 minutes, the door opened once more. This time it was not the master of ceremonies, but the Queen's private secretary, a discreet man with a smooth face and sharp eyes. "Lord and Lady Ashford," he said, bowing. "Her Majesty begs a brief word with you both." Her parents exchanged a quick glance. "Of course," her father said. "Margaret?" The secretary raised a hand. "If you will permit, my lord, Her Majesty wishes to speak to you alone. Lady Margaret will remain here." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Her Majesty will explain," he said. "I assure you, Lady Margaret, there is no cause for panic." Panic. The word did nothing to calm her. Her mother squeezed her arm, an unusually soft gesture. "Sit," she said. "Drink some water. We shall return presently." They left with the secretary, the door closing behind them, with a soft click that sounded final. Silence rushed in. Clara shifted awkwardly. "Shall I pour you some water, my lady?" "Yes," Margaret said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Clara crossed to the table and poured. The glass trembled faintly in her hand. Margaret took it and sipped, but the water might as well have been air. "They will only be a moment," Clara said. "Her Majesty likely wishes to tell them how proud she is, or to speak of some detail." Margaret made herself nod. Her mind, however, was running ahead. What detail would require the Queen to speak to her parents without her? What message would be conveyed in such a way? She rose abruptly and paced the length of the room, the train of her gown whispering over the carpet. "Careful, my lady," Clara murmured. "Mind the hem." "I am careful," Margaret said. She stopped, pressing her hands together to keep them from shaking. "I am always careful." After what felt like an hour, but could not have been more than 10 minutes, the door opened again. Her parents entered alone. The Queen's secretary was nowhere to be seen. Her mother's colour was higher than usual. Her father's mouth was a thin line. "What did she say?" Margaret asked at once. Her father spoke first. "Her Majesty assures us that the prince is well," he said. "He asked to speak to you alone before the ceremony resumes." Margaret's heart gave a violent jump. "To speak to me? Why?" Her mother lifted her chin. "Because he is a conscientious man," she said. "He wishes, it seems, to be certain of your state of mind. No doubt he has tales of young ladies losing their nerve at the last moment. He wishes to reassure himself. You will reassure him, Margaret. You will be calm, composed, and grateful. You will not indulge in romantic dramatics." "Edith," her husband said quietly, "that is enough." The Countess pressed her lips together and looked away. Margaret felt as if the room had tipped. "He thinks I might want to draw back," she asked. "Do you?" her father asked very gently. She thought of Thomas in the orchards at Ashford, of walks in the gardens with Edward, of the burned letter, of Agnes's steady eyes. She thought of her parents' faces in the Queen's presence. "No," she said at once, "no. Whatever foolishness I once entertained, I do not wish to run. I wish only to walk down that aisle and have it done, to belong to myself and to him, and not to everyone else's expectations." Her father's shoulders eased a fraction. "Then you must tell him so," he said. with clarity, with dignity. If he has doubts, you must dispel them. And if he has more than doubts? She asked. If he has something against me? Her mother moved closer. What could he have? She demanded. You have done nothing improper. Margaret's throat tightened. Nothing that could be photographed, she said. But we all make our mistakes, Mama. Her mother's eyes narrowed. Have you been imprudent? I have done nothing that would appear in a scandal sheet, Margaret said. That, at least, was true. But there are thoughts. Letters. Her father held up a hand. Whatever the case, he said, this is not the moment for confession. If there is something you must tell him, do so when you are both less exposed. For now, go to him. Hear what he has to say. Answer honestly. But remember that every word spoken today may shape your life. The door opened once more. The same equerry from before stood there, looking slightly more strained now. Lady Margaret, he said, bowing. His Royal Highness awaits you in the small sacristy. Margaret looked at her parents. May I go? Her father kissed her forehead, something he had not done in years. Go, he said. And remember, whatever happens, you are my daughter. Her mother gave her a swift, almost fierce embrace. Remember who you are, she murmured. Remember what is at stake. Clara hurried to smooth the front of her gown and straighten the veil. Then Margaret followed the equerry out into the corridor. The castle's stone passages seemed both familiar and strange. Everywhere were signs of celebration. Flowers in vases, crimson runners, liveried servants pressed against the walls as she passed. Farther off, she could hear the faint restlessness of the congregation in the chapel, like the rustle of a great, unheard sea. The sacristy door stood slightly ajar. The equerry bowed and withdrew, leaving her alone for a moment in the corridor. She lifted her hand, hesitated, then tapped softly. Enter, came Edward's voice. She stepped inside. The room was small, lined with shelves holding books and vestments. A single high window let in grey light. Edward stood near a narrow table, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture very straight. He was still in full wedding dress, the medals on his chest catching the light. For a heartbeat she saw not the prince but the man she had come to know, the one who had argued with her about village schools, who had smiled when she teased him about his handwriting. Then she saw the chill in his eyes. She sank into a curtsy. Your Royal Highness. Margaret, he said. His voice was polite, but there was a stiffness in it that cut her. Please, rise, she obeyed. Her hands, unbidden, twisted in the folds of her gown. She forced them to stillness. You wish to speak with me? She asked. Yes, he said. He studied her for a moment, as if memorizing her face. We have very little time. The court grows impatient. Forgive me if I am direct. She swallowed. I prefer directness. You said earlier, he began, and his tone changed, acquiring a strange familiarity. You said, my parents have pinned their survival upon this day. The court expects perfection. The Queen expects obedience. He expects devotion. I cannot shatter everything with the truth. She froze. The words were her own, down to the slight hesitation before devotion. How do you know that? She whispered. I heard you, he said, in the antechamber. I did not mean to listen. I passed by and heard my name, and before I could move away, you were speaking of me as though I were a weight upon your shoulders. A duty, a man you did not love at first, but chose because he could save your family. Her heart began to pound so hard she thought it would shake the veil. I did not know the door was open, she said faintly. I thought we were alone. So did I, he answered, until I was not. Shall we speak plainly, Margaret? Did you at the beginning accept me out of love or out of desperation? She drew a breath that felt like swallowing glass. At the beginning, she said, I accepted you because I believed it was my duty and because my parents were drowning. I hoped affection would come. I did not yet know you. I knew only what the world knows of a prince. And now, he asked, now I know you, she said, her voice low but steady. Now I love you for yourself. But I cannot pretend that the beginning was something it was not. He watched her, searching her face. You spoke of another man, he said. Thomas. He was the one I truly loved. Those were your words. They were my words, she whispered. About a time before you, before all of this. I believed then that my heart belonged elsewhere, in another kind of life. I chose not to follow that path. I chose this one, and somewhere along it, my heart came with me. I cannot change what I felt at 19. I can only tell you what I feel at 21. His jaw tightened. You also spoke of a letter, he said, to someone abroad, a letter in which you contemplated breaking our engagement if only you could find another escape. A letter in which you hinted that you might be willing to be useful. Shame burned up her neck. You heard that as well? Yes, she forced herself to meet his eyes. Then you know almost all of the worst of me, she said. I wrote such a letter. In a moment of terror and selfishness, I felt trapped. I thought only of myself and of my parents and of the boy I had turned away. I did not send it. I burned it. I have never acted upon such thoughts, but I cannot deny that I had them. I am ashamed of them every day. He looked at her in silence for a long moment. She saw hurt there and anger, but also something like grief. Do you understand, he said quietly, what it is to stand where I stand? To know that the woman who is to share my life was once willing to use my name as a bargaining chip. That, had events turned a little differently, we might not be standing here at all, and I might have learned only from some foreign minister's amused remark that I had been weighed and found inconvenient. Yes, she said, I do, or I try. I have thought of it often. It makes me sick to remember. If you demand my head for it, I will not blame you. But I cannot unwrite the letter. I can only tell you that the woman who wrote it would not do so now. He turned away, running a hand through his hair, disturbing its perfect arrangement. For a moment he looked less like a prince and more like a man wrestling with himself. The Queen says, he said slowly, that I must decide whether I will marry the girl you were or the woman you are. I do not know yet which of you will be at that altar. It will be the woman, she said quickly. The girl burned with the letter, or I hope she did. I cannot ask you to forget. I ask only that you weigh me as I am against what I was. If you choose not to marry me, I will walk out of this castle with my head up and accept whatever the world throws. He faced her again. You say you love me now, he said. Not my position, not the rescue I offered your parents. Me. Yes, she said. The word came from the very center of her. How can I be sure? He asked. How can I know that, if the world turned and I were no longer a prince, you would still look at me as you do now? She gave a small, sad smile. You cannot be sure, she said, any more than I can be sure that you would have looked twice at me had I been the daughter of a country solicitor. We are both bound by the lives we were born into. All I can offer is my word, and the proof of the last months. You have seen me argue with you when I disagreed. You have seen me stand up to your ministers when I thought them wrong. Does that look like a woman currying favor, or like someone who cares enough to risk your displeasure? He remembered her sharp words to the Home Secretary about factory conditions, the way she had gone pale but not backed down. The memory tugged at him. The door opened suddenly. The Archbishop's aide poked his head in, eyes wide. Your Royal Highness, he said, flustered. Forgive me, but the Queen requests that the ceremony proceed. The congregation is becoming restless. There are whispers. We can delay no longer without serious offense. Edward's jaw clenched. I see, he said. The aide hesitated. His gaze flicked to Margaret, then back to the prince. Shall I inform them you will be ready in 5 minutes, sir? Edward looked at Margaret. Her eyes were wide above the veil. Her hands clenched so tightly the knuckles showed white. He felt as though he were standing on a narrow bridge over a chasm, with no time left to choose a direction. We will be ready, he said at last. The aide vanished, relieved. Silence fell again. We are to walk out there, Edward said, and stand before them all. They expect a fairy tale. They know nothing of letters or burned pages or boys named Thomas. We must either give them their story or tear it apart. Margaret swallowed. What will you do? He looked at her, his gaze searching, almost desperate. I do not yet know, he said. Only this. Whatever happens, I cannot pretend any longer. Not with you, not with them. He stepped back, putting a small distance between them, as if he needed the space to breathe. You must go to the robing chamber by the chapel doors, he said. They are waiting for you. I must take my place at the altar. Edward, she whispered. She had never called him that in such an unguarded tone. If you mean to refuse me, do it here. Do not make me walk the length of that aisle not knowing whether I am to be a wife or a spectacle. Pain flickered across his face. Do you think this is easy for me? He said quietly. To stand before God and ask questions no groom should have to ask? To weigh my duty to the crown against my heart? I must see what I am capable of saying when I am there. I do not wish to humiliate you, but I will not live a lie. She drew herself up, gathering what remained of her dignity. Very well, she said. Then I shall walk, and whatever you do at the other end, I will bear it. He flinched but said nothing. He moved to the door, opened it, and called for the equerry. Please conduct Lady Margaret to the robing chamber, he said, his tone formal. The procession will begin at once. The equerry bowed. Margaret moved past Edward, close enough that the lace of her sleeve brushed his cuff. For a moment she almost turned, almost reached for his hand, but pride held her still. She followed the equerry down the corridor toward the chapel, her heart beating like a drum. The sounds of the waiting throng grew louder with every step. At the small robing room by the great doors, she paused. A pair of bridesmaids waited there, eyes bright with curiosity and unease. The prince is in his place, someone murmured. The queen looks like stone, whispered another. Margaret barely heard them. Her father appeared at her side, offering his arm. Her mother stood by the door, her face composed, but her eyes sharp. Are you well? Her father asked. As well as I am likely to be, she said. Outside, the organ struck up a triumphant chord. The great doors shuddered as the footmen took their positions. Margaret drew a breath, tasting fear and resolve in equal measure, and stepped into place, not knowing whether the man waiting at the altar would still be willing to marry her. The great doors swung open, and sound crashed over Margaret like a wave. The organ thundered. People rose in a rustle of silk and uniforms. The air felt thicker, as though all the breath had been pulled to the far end of the chapel where the altar stood. Steady, her father murmured. One step at a time. She tightened her fingers on his arm. The aisle stretched out before them, flanked by rows of faces. She did not try to focus on any one person. She let them blur into colors and shapes. If she began to recognize them, she might see curiosity, pity, or worse, delight at the delay. Her gaze went straight to the altar. Edward stood there, tall and controlled, the red of his uniform cutting a sharp line against the pale stone. The medals on his chest shone. His shoulders were perfectly squared. From where she stood, she could not read his expression clearly, but there was a stillness in his posture that made her stomach twist. He did not lean to speak to the archbishop. He did not look back at the queen. He stood, as if carved and waiting. Walk, her father whispered. Her veil slipped down as they took the first step. The lace softened the outlines of the world. Edward became a figure behind a fine mist, both near and impossibly distant. The murmur of the congregation hushed as she moved. Every footstep sounded too loud in her ears, the tap of her shoes on the stone beating like a slow drum. She could feel hundreds of eyes measuring the set of her shoulders, the tilt of her head, the steadiness of her stride. She heard a faint whisper from somewhere on the left. She looks pale. Wouldn't you? At least he appeared. That last phrase lodged in her like a splinter. At least he appeared. As if there had been a chance he might not. Her father's grip tightened slightly, steering her around a slight ripple in the carpet. Almost there, he murmured. She looked up again. Edward's face came into clearer view as the distance shrank. He was pale, too, not with illness but with strain. His mouth was a firm line. His eyes, when they finally met hers through the veil, were not cold exactly, but grave, searching, as if he were trying to find something in her that would tip a scale. She wanted to smile at him, to bridge the distance with some small private signal. Her lips moved, but no smile came. Her throat was too tight. They reached the front at last. Her father stopped, turned to her, and carefully transferred her hand into Edward's. The contact jolted her. His glove was warm. For an instant she remembered his hand closing over hers when she stumbled on a garden path months ago. The same hand had steadied her, strong and gentle. Now it felt like a question. The archbishop's voice rose, sonorous and practiced. Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God, and in the face of this congregation. The familiar phrases flowed over her. She had heard parts of the service in practices, had even mouthed them before her glass, trying to imagine how she would sound. Today they seemed to come from far away, as if from another life. Edward did not look at the Archbishop. He did not look at the congregation. He watched Margaret. His gaze flickered once to her father, then returned to her face. "Into this holy estate these two persons present come now to be joined," the Archbishop continued. "Therefore, if any man can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his peace." A little shiver ran through the crowd. People shifted, heads turned slightly, as if to see if anyone would be bold or mad enough to stand. Margaret's heart hammered. The words had always sounded ceremonial to her before, a relic from some older age. Now they fell on her like a dare. If any man can show just cause. There was cause. There had been a letter, a boy, a calculation. None of it known to the Archbishop, or to the rows of titled observers. Only to two women in an antechamber and one prince behind a door he had not meant to pause at. She felt Edward's hand stir faintly around hers. A tiny movement, a tightening of his fingers, then stillness. No one spoke, no one rose. The pause stretched a heartbeat longer than usual. A murmur began at the back and was quickly hushed. The Archbishop cleared his throat, took the silence for consent, and continued. "I require and charge you both, as you will answer at the dreadful day of judgment, when the secrets of all hearts shall be disclosed." Margaret almost laughed at that, a quick, hysterical sound she managed to hold back. The secrets of all hearts had already been disclosed to the one person whose opinion mattered most. She tore her eyes from Edward's and glanced sideways, seeking some anchor in the blur of faces. She caught a glimpse of Agnes, seated among the ladies. Agnes's hands were clasped tightly together in her lap. When she saw Margaret looking, she gave the smallest nod, a gesture of support that no one else would notice. Near the front, the Queen sat with her back very straight. Her face was impassive, but Margaret noticed the whiteness of her knuckles where they gripped her fan. Her mother looked rigid, lips pressed together. Her father's head was slightly bowed, as if in prayer. The Archbishop led them through the familiar questions. "Edward, wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife?" Edward's voice, when it came, was steady, but quieter than she expected. "I will." The words sent a quick flare of warmth through her chest, dulled at once by the knowledge of what lay beneath them. The Archbishop turned to her. "Margaret, wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband?" She did not hesitate. "I will." The words came clear and firm. Whatever else was uncertain, that was not. They moved on through the responses. The dignity of the language gave her something to cling to. She listened to herself, promised to obey and serve, to love and cherish. She listened to Edward repeat his part, their voices braided briefly in the echo of the stone. Then came the moment for the vows themselves. "Who giveth this woman to be married to this man?" Her father stepped forward, his voice rougher than usual as he answered, "I do." He placed her hand again in Edward's. The touch felt different now. Final. The congregation leaned in almost imperceptibly, hungry to witness the exact instant when two people became one story. The Archbishop nodded. "Repeat after me," he said to Edward. "I, Edward, take thee, Margaret, to my wedded wife." Edward drew a breath. Margaret felt it in the tremor of his fingers around hers, but he did not speak. The Archbishop waited, a faint crease appearing between his brows. The silence lengthened. Margaret looked up sharply. Edward's eyes were no longer only on her. He was looking past her now, sweeping the assembled faces, the Queen, his uncles, the foreign princes, the rows of lords and bishops. "Your Royal Highness?" the Archbishop prompted softly. "If you please." Instead of repeating the words, Edward released Margaret's hand. The shock of it made her flinch. The congregation gasped as one. A wave of whispers rose, then stilled under the Queen's swift, decisive glance. Edward turned to the Archbishop. "Your Grace," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the hush, "I must beg your pardon. I find I cannot at this moment speak the words as if there were no shadow upon them." The Archbishop blinked. "Shadow, sir?" Edward turned to face the congregation fully. Margaret stood, her hand suddenly empty, feeling exposed and small beside him. "All of you here," Edward said, "have come to witness what is supposed to be the most joyful day of my life, the day on which I bind myself to a woman in the sight of God and the nation, the day on which we present a union meant to stand as an example of trust and fidelity." His words were measured, But Margaret heard the strain beneath the smoothness. "There has been much talk," he went on, "of duty, of alliances, of the future of the crown. All of it important, all of it weighty, and yet there is something more fundamental than any of that." He paused. "Truth." A murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the speech they had come to hear. "Sometimes," Edward said, "we arrive at the altar not as creatures of perfect romance, but as flawed human beings who have stumbled our way here, making mistakes, hurting others, failing to be as brave as we ought. Such is my case. Such is, I suspect, the case of my bride as well." Margaret's heart thudded painfully. The stone under her feet felt suddenly cold. She saw Agnes press a hand to her mouth. Her mother had gone very still, eyes wide. Her father's face was bloodless. The Queen sat without moving a muscle, but something in her gaze sharpened, as if she were watching a chessboard where a piece had just shifted in an unexpected direction. The Archbishop shifted uncertainly. "Your Royal Highness," he murmured. "Perhaps—" "Allow me a few more sentences, Your Grace," Edward said. "After that, if you believe I have gone too far, you may consign me to the care of the Almighty at once." A nervous ripple of laughter ran through the congregation and died quickly. Edward turned back to the people, but his next words seemed directed as much to Margaret as to them. "A marriage such as this," he said, "stands at the intersection of two worlds. There is the private world, where two individuals must live with each other's faults, learn each other's hearts, bear each other's burdens. And there is the public world, where every smile, every gesture is weighed and measured and interpreted. We are asked to be symbols, yet we remain stubbornly people." He looked at Margaret again, and she felt flayed by the intensity of his gaze. "In private," he said, his voice gentler, "I have learned that Lady Margaret is a woman of intelligence, compassion, and courage. I have seen her speak against injustice, even when silence would have been safer. I have seen her kindness to those who could offer her nothing in return. I have come to value her deeply." The word he had almost said instead hung unspoken between them. "In private," he continued, "I have also learned that we both carry regrets, that she has not always loved me as she might, that I have not always sought to understand her burdens as well as I could, that fear and duty have at times warped both our choices." The whispering grew louder. A few people shifted in their seats, craning their necks. It was clear now that something had been wrong with this wedding, long before the doors opened. Margaret felt heat rising under the veil. Her hands shook where they hung at her sides. She wanted to vanish and stand taller at the same time. Edward looked back at the Archbishop. "I stand here," he said, "unable to say, 'I take thee,' without acknowledging that the path to this point has not been pure. There have been letters unwisely written and burned. There have been affections given and withdrawn. There has been, on my part, a willingness to accept less than complete honesty as long as appearances were smooth." A collective gasp greeted the word letters. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. He had not named her crime outright, but the hint was enough for those with imagination. He turned to the Queen. "My mother reminded me, not long ago, that perfection is not required at the beginning of a long union, only the willingness to walk into it with open eyes. I find that I can no longer walk blind." The Queen's face did not change, but Margaret saw in the slight relaxing of her jaw that she understood what he meant. Edward faced the congregation again. "I will not," he said, his voice firm now, "build my marriage on a lie. Not the lie that my bride and I have been paragons of disinterested devotion from the moment we met, nor the lie that our union is only a political arrangement with no heart in it at all. Somewhere between those two stories lies the truth. It is there I wish to stand." The stillness in the chapel had changed. It was no longer the polite attention of people witnessing a ceremony they had seen a dozen times. It was the taut, strained silence of people watching something unprecedented and dangerous unfold. The Archbishop cleared his throat again. "Your Royal Highness," he said carefully, "what is it you propose?" "I propose only this," Edward said, "that before we speak words no human hand can unmake, I ask my bride a question which I should have had the courage to ask long ago, without crowns or altars or witnesses." He turned fully toward Margaret. The world narrowed to his face and her breath. The veil blurred his features slightly, but she could see his eyes dark and intent. "Lady Margaret," he said. And though he spoke loudly enough to be heard in the furthest pew, the tone was intimate, as if it were only the two of them. We stand before God and before these people. They have come expecting a fairy tale. You and I know better than anyone that the story is more complicated than that. She swallowed. Her mouth felt dry as ash. You have been honest with me in private, he said. You have told me of your fears, your shame, your mistakes. You have spoken of love that has grown where once there was only duty. Beginning today, if we go forward, there must be no more half-truths between us. He drew a careful breath. So I ask you now, not as a prince to his subject, not as a symbol to an adornment, but as a man to the woman he may call his wife. Do you love me at all? For a long moment, Margaret could not feel her legs. The world had narrowed to the curve of Edward's mouth, and the question hanging between them. Do you love me at all? The chapel held its breath with her. The scrape of a shoe, the distant rustle of someone's sleeve, the faint creak of a pew. Every sound seemed magnified. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her throat was dry. She could lie. She could say yes in the smooth, practiced tone expected of a bride, let the ceremony glide back into its track, and spend the rest of her life wondering if he believed her. Or she could tell the truth, the whole of it, in front of everyone. Her knees wobbled. Your Royal Highness, the Archbishop murmured, torn between horror and concern. This is hardly— Let her answer, Edward said quietly, without looking away from her. She drew a breath. It shook. Yes, she whispered. The sound barely rose above the hush. A few of the people near the front heard it. Further back, faces strained. Edward's eyes did not soften. I did not hear you, he said, voice steady. And neither did anyone else hear. Her spine straightened. If she was to hang, she would do it standing. Yes, she said louder, I love you. Not as I ought to have from the beginning. Not with the simplicity everyone expected. I have been foolish and selfish and afraid. But I love you now, with what heart I have. A whisper like wind through leaves swept the chapel. She forced herself to go on. I did not love you first, she said. I loved the idea of saving my family. I loved a dream of another life. I tried to run from all of this in my mind. I failed. And then, while I was failing, I met you as you are, not as a prince in a story, but as a man who cares, who thinks, who listens. My respect grew before I knew my heart had followed. I cannot change what I was, but I can stand here and say that I do love you now. If that is not enough, you should not marry me. Silence followed, deep and shocked. Somewhere in the third row, a dowager duchess dropped her fan. It hit the floor with a soft crack. Edward stared at her. For a moment, the mask he had worn all morning slipped. She saw raw pain and something like hope flicker across his features. The Archbishop cleared his throat, clearly at the end of his endurance. Perhaps, he said carefully, in light of emotions running high, it would be prudent to withdraw for a few moments. A private word between the couple, under God, before we proceed, or not. His voice faltered slightly on the last word. All eyes turned to the Queen. She rose with unhurried grace. This assembly will remain seated, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. The Prince and Lady Margaret will withdraw for a short time. When they return, we will either resume the ceremony or be informed of their decision. You will all remember that we are in a consecrated place, and your tongues should behave accordingly. The warning landed like a light slap. Edward inclined his head to her. Thank you, ma'am, he said. He turned back to Margaret and offered his arm. Come, he said quietly. Her hand trembled as she laid it on his sleeve. They walked side by side down the steps from the altar, past the watching eyes. No music covered their retreat. Their footsteps rang in the vaulted space. Margaret kept her gaze straight ahead. She did not look at her parents. She did not dare. She caught only a blur of Agnes, pale and wide-eyed. The side door closed behind them with a heavy click, shutting out the crowd and the candles and the murmurs. The sudden quiet was almost violent. A royal usher led them down a short passage into a modest withdrawing room. A wooden table, a few chairs, a prie-dieu, a small fireplace, that was all. It felt like another world. The usher bowed and stepped back. I shall wait outside, sir, he said. If you call, I will fetch whomever you wish. He closed the door, leaving them alone. Edward moved to the middle of the room and stopped. He did not sit. Margaret remained by the door, her back instinctively pressed to the panel, breath coming shallow and fast. He broke the silence first. "You are very brave," he said quietly, "or very reckless." "A little of both, I think," she answered. Her voice sounded thin. "You asked me a question. I could not answer it with half a truth." He studied her through the veil. "You understand what you have just done," he said. "In front of all of them." "Yes," she said. "I have humiliated myself thoroughly, and perhaps I am sorry for that." "Humiliation is not always the worst thing that can befall a prince," he said, a wry note slipping in despite himself. "Being deceived quietly might be worse." She flinched. "I have deceived you by silence," she said, "not by malice. I thought it kinder not to unburden myself on you. I thought my shame should be borne alone." "Do you still think so?" he asked. She hesitated. "No," she said, "not now." He walked a few steps, hands clasped behind him again, then turned to her. "Take off the veil," he said. Her fingers flew to the comb, clumsy with nerves. She lifted the veil back, freeing her face. The air on her skin felt shockingly cool. He watched her, taking in the pallor of her cheeks, the strain in her eyes. "You look as if you might faint," he said. "Do you need to sit?" "If I sit, I may not get up again," she replied. "Let me stand." He nodded once. "Very well. Then let us finish what we began in the sacristy, this time without the organ rattling the walls." She searched his face. "What else can I say that you do not already know?" she asked. "You heard almost everything." "I heard fragments," he said. "Snatched phrases through a door. I want to hear the whole from your mouth, beginning to end, with nothing smoothed over for my benefit. If we go back in there, I cannot have ghosts lingering in the corners." She drew another deep breath. "Very well," she said. "Ask." He did not ask at once. Instead, he stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint shadow of stubble along his jaw, the tiny lines at the corners of his eyes. "Tell me about him," he said. "Thomas, as you would have told me if I had had the sense to ask when we were first betrothed." She had expected that. She had dreaded it. "He was—" She forced herself not to look away. "He was kind. Not remarkable to others, but kind, thoughtful. He listened when I spoke of the tenants and the village children. He believed the world could be made better by small acts. He asked if I could be happy in a smaller life. I never promised him anything, not outright. But I let him see that my heart was not indifferent." "Did you kiss him?" Edward asked very quietly. The question startled her. "No," she said. "No. I knew the line I could not cross. We walked, we talked, we read. That was all. My sin was not in what I did with him, but in what I dreamed and in what I later wrote." "And now," he asked, "if he walked into this room at this moment and said, 'Come away with me, no chapel, no crown,' what would you do?" She did not have to think. "I would stay," she said. "Even if you sent me away from you, I would not go to him. That path is closed. I chose against it. I have grieved it, and now I have let it go." Something eased almost imperceptibly in his shoulders. "And the letter," he said. "Say it plainly. I want to be able to repeat it in my mind without wondering what I have embellished." She flushed. "I wrote," she said, each word slow and careful, "to a woman in Paris. I said I was about to accept an offer from you. I said I did not love you, that my parents were urging me. I hinted that I might break the engagement if I had another escape. I hinted that I could be useful, that I might hear things, see things. I did not name anything specific. It was all vague and foolish, like a girl who has read too many novels and confuses her own life with some melodrama. And then, when my senses returned, I burned it. No reply ever came, because it was never delivered." "You are certain?" he demanded. "No copy. No second letter." "I am certain," she said. "I went myself to the servant and made him find it in the pouch. I watched it burn. The only person in the world who knew of it before today was Agnes, and now you, and whoever among that congregation can put two and two together from your speech." He winced slightly. "I did not name you," he said, "nor the letter, but I suppose I waved a red cloth in front of half the gossips in Europe." She gave a small, humorless smile. "I helped you," she said. "They will feast on my confession for months." He looked at her for a long moment. "Are you angry with me?" he asked. "For asking you that question in public?" "Yes," she said, surprising them both. "A little. I understand why you did it. I understand that you wanted the truth where everyone could see it. But you put my heart on display like a specimen. You put your own there too. It was cruel in a way. Honest but cruel." He nodded slowly. "I know," he said. "The cruelty was unintentional, but not imaginary. I'm not proud of it. I have been wrestling all morning with the desire to protect my dignity and the desire to protect you. At the altar, in that moment, dignity won. It was not my finest choice." She blinked. She had not expected him to admit it so directly. "You are not the only one who has made mistakes," he went on. "I chose to listen at that door instead of walking away. I chose not to confront you at once, but to let the knowledge fester until it erupted in the worst possible place. I chose to speak as if I were alone in my pain and you were the only one who had something to confess. That was unjust." Her throat tightened. "Why are you saying this?" she asked softly. "Because," he said, "if I ask you to show me your worst self, I must show you mine. You should know the man you may be tying yourself to is proud, stubborn, and occasionally dramatic in front of archbishops." A startled laugh escaped her. It broke on a sob halfway out. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. "I do know," she said, muffled. "I have seen you lose your temper with that pompous ambassador from Vienna. It was quite a show." He almost smiled. Almost. "He deserved it," he muttered. Then his face sobered. "Margaret, we cannot stay here forever. They are waiting." "I know," she said. "What will you do?" He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I can do several things," he said. "I can return to that chapel and announce that the wedding is cancelled. I can say I discovered that our path here was compromised, and I have chosen not to proceed. I can take the blame onto myself, say that I doubted myself, that I am unready. It would spare you somewhat. Not entirely, but more than if I called you false." She swallowed hard. "And the other thing," he drew a breath. "Or," he said, "I can return to that chapel with you on my arm. I can tell them that we troubled the waters because we believed such vows should not be spoken lightly. I can say that we will go forward with clearer eyes and humbler hearts. I can choose to forgive the girl you were and love the woman you are. That choice, however, I cannot make alone." She stared at him. "You ask me what I want." "Yes," he said simply. "I should have asked you properly at the beginning before your parents ever pressed you. I ask now, late but in earnest. Do you wish to marry me? Not the Prince of Wales. Me. If I were, say, the second son of a minor duke with a middling estate and an inconvenient interest in politics." She did not hesitate. "Yes," she said. "If you were a clerk in your own government offices, I would still wish to marry you. I would argue with you about the tax on tea and remind you to eat your dinner instead of working through it. I would be less afraid of failing you, but I would still wish it." Emotion flickered in his eyes, quick and sharp. "You must also know this," she added. "If you choose not to marry me, I will not collapse. I will grieve and I will bear the consequences. I will not run to Thomas or to anyone else. I will attempt to live honestly, however quietly, with whatever is left of my reputation. You owe me nothing because I love you." He took a step closer. "That," he said, "is why I cannot in honor cast you aside now. You say you love me without demanding the crown in return. You offer to walk away for my sake. If I send you out there alone, I will spend the rest of my life wondering whether I have thrown away the one person who was willing to tell me the truth when it cost her everything." Her eyes blurred. "Then, what is your answer?" His jaw worked once, as if he were biting back something raw. Then he nodded. "I will marry you," he said quietly. "Not because the Queen desires it. Not because your family needs it. Because you stood before a crowd that could have shredded you and told the truth. Because you were willing to burn a letter and then live with the shame alone. Because when I showed you my worst temper, you did not flatter me or lie. I think you are a woman with whom I can share the weight of a kingdom." She exhaled. It left her almost dizzy. "However," he added, "we must attend to a few things first. Your parents, my mother, and what precisely we are going to say when we walk back into that chapel so that the Archbishop does not faint dead away." She let out a shaky half-laugh. "That seems practical. Where shall we begin?" "With making sure you are no longer shackled by your parents' fear," he said. "If we are to marry, I will not have you believing for a single day that you must please me to keep them from ruin." He moved to the door and opened it. The usher straightened from his post. "Send Her Majesty word," Edward said. "If she is speaking with Lord and Lady Ashford, ask that they come here. If not, ask that she meet me in the side parlour in 10 minutes. Say that her son requests her assistance as a mother, not a queen." "Yes, sir." The man hurried off. Edward closed the door again and turned back to Margaret. "Sit," he said. "You will do me more credit if you are not swaying like a sapling when we return." This time she obeyed. She sank into one of the chairs. The relief in her legs was immediate. Her hands still trembled in her lap. He stood by the mantelpiece, staring at the unlit grate. For a moment neither spoke. "Edward," she said quietly. "Yes, thank you," she said, "for giving me a choice, for not deciding everything over my head." "That is the least a husband should do," he replied. "I am merely belated in learning it." The door opened again a few minutes later. The Queen entered, followed by Lord and Lady Ashford. The Queen's gaze swept the room, taking in Margaret's pale face, Edward's rigid posture. "Is it to be a wedding or a disaster, Edward?" she asked with a tired sort of dryness. "A wedding," he said, "if you will help us tidy the wreckage I have already made." Relief flashed, quick and unhidden, across her features before she schooled them again. "Very well," she said. "Let us see what can be salvaged." Margaret's mother stepped forward at once. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice strained, "if my daughter has said anything ill-advised—" "Lady Ashford," the Queen interrupted, not unkindly, "your daughter has shown more courage this morning than most courtiers manage in a lifetime. If there is any apology to be made, it is not from her to me." The Countess faltered, silenced. Lord Ashford looked from the Queen to his daughter, then to Edward. His eyes were full of questions he did not dare voice. "Father," Margaret said softly, "I have told him everything. About Thomas, about the letter." Her cheeks flushed. "He still wishes to marry me. If you are ashamed, be ashamed of me, not of him." Lord Ashford closed his eyes briefly, as if something inside him gave way. "I am ashamed," he said quietly, "of what I have allowed you to bear alone. We have placed too much on your shoulders. I should have found another way." "There was no other way," the Countess protested, but her voice was less certain. "We would have been ruined." "Perhaps," the Queen said, turning her clear gaze on them. "That is a question you should have brought to me, rather than making your daughter your sole remedy." Both Ashfords stiffened. "Ma'am," Lord Ashford said, flushing, "I would not presume to trouble your Majesty with my private incompetence." "Yet you were content to let your daughter's entire life be rearranged on its account," the Queen replied. "Let us speak plainly. Your estate has been declining for years. Your creditors hover. You have made unwise investments." He swallowed hard. "Yes, ma'am. My son has chosen to marry Margaret, not only with knowledge of her past fears, but with affection for her present character," she went on. "Whether or not this wedding had taken place, I would not have let the Ashford name slide into public disgrace for lack of attention. The Crown has an interest in preventing its nobility from collapsing like poorly built houses." Lord Ashford stared. I do not understand." "If this wedding had been called off," she said, "I would have arranged, through appropriate channels, the restructuring of your debts, discreetly, quietly, on condition that you stop gambling with futures you cannot afford to lose." The Countess blinked, colour draining from her face. "Your Majesty is generous," she managed. "I am practical," the Queen said. "A noble family in shreds creates scandal. A young woman sacrificed on the altar of her parents' fear creates tragedy. I prefer to avoid both where possible." She turned back to Margaret. "You must hear this, child," she said. And for the first time that day she sounded more like a mother than a monarch. "From this hour, your parents' survival is not your burden to carry alone. If you become my daughter by marriage, you will not do so as payment for their debts. If in some other universe you did not marry my son, you would still not be abandoned to disgrace on their behalf. Do you understand?" Margaret's vision blurred. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered. Edward watched her, something gentle in his eyes. "There remains the question of what to say when we return," the Queen said briskly. "You have made half a scandal already. You may as well shape the rest of it yourselves." "I will speak," Edward said. I began this uproar, I will calm it. And I, Margaret said quickly, would like to say something as well, if you permit it, ma'am. Edward glanced at her. You have said enough for 3 lifetimes today, he said. You need not expose yourself further. If I do not, she replied, they will fill in the silence with their own tales. I would rather they hear at least a fragment of the truth from my own mouth. I owe that much to the woman I hope to be. The Queen considered her. What would you say? She asked. Margaret swallowed. That I was afraid, she said. That I let duty frighten me into poor choices. That I came to love him after I had already promised myself, and that it took courage I did not possess at first. That I stand there today by choice, not compulsion. The Queen's gaze softened again. Very well, she said. You may speak. Briefly. The Archbishop will have a fit if we turn his pulpit into a parliament. Edward gave a faint, anxious huff of laughter. Lord Ashford looked at his daughter. Margaret, he said, voice thick, if you wish to step back even now— I do not, she said firmly. Not on your account nor on mine. I have chosen. I will not unchoose simply because the world is watching. Her mother gave a small, strangled sound. I do not deserve you, she whispered. No, Margaret said gently. But you are my mother, and I know you are afraid. Let us all try to do better from here. The Queen glanced at the clock on the mantel. We have kept them waiting long enough, she said. Another 5 minutes, and they will be inventing revolutions in the pews. She moved to the door and opened it. The usher straightened again, eyes wide. Tell the Archbishop, she said, that the Prince and Lady Margaret are ready to return. He is to resume the service where he left off. And if anyone faints, he is not to blame me. Yes, ma'am. The usher darted off. The Queen looked back at her son and future daughter-in-law. Are you quite certain? She asked quietly. Either of you can still say no. Edward stepped to Margaret's side. He held out his arm. I am certain, he said. Margaret placed her hand on his sleeve. This time the gesture felt different. Not like surrender, but like joining. So am I, she said. The Queen nodded once, satisfaction and something like pride flickering in her eyes. She stepped aside to let them pass. Lord and Lady Ashford both bowed their heads as the couple moved by. Agnes, waiting anxiously in the corridor with a cluster of ladies, caught Margaret's eye and managed a watery smile. Margaret gave her the smallest nod. They reached the small side door that led back into the chapel. On the other side, the murmurs swelled like distant surf. Edward paused with his hand on the latch. Last chance to run, he murmured, just for her. She looked up at him. For the first time that day, her answering smile reached her eyes. Not this time, she said. Not from you. He drew a breath, squared his shoulders, and opened the door. Together, side by side, they stepped forward to face whatever waited beyond. The murmur inside the chapel hit them like a physical thing when the door opened. It was not loud, but it had weight. Hundreds of voices, held just below a whisper, washed together into a hushed tide. Heads turned as one. Fans stilled. The organist's hands hovered above the keys waiting for a cue. Edward and Margaret stepped through the narrow doorway and paused on the small landing. For a heartbeat they were framed in the arch, side by side, his red uniform and her white gown catching the light. Margaret felt every gaze like a touch on her skin. Her hand tightened on Edward's arm. Straight ahead, he murmured, so low only she could hear. We walked together. They descended the few steps and moved back toward the altar. No music accompanied them this time. The only sounds were their footsteps and the faint rustle of curiosity. The Archbishop stood waiting, his face a careful blend of serenity and alarm. Behind him, the altar candles burned steadily, as if nothing at all unusual had occurred. Edward led Margaret to the spot where they had stood before. He did not immediately take her hand. Instead, he turned to face the congregation once more. Margaret's heart fluttered. She braced herself. Ladies and gentlemen, Edward said, his voice calm, we have tried your patience. For that we ask your pardon. A man and woman, before making promises that will shape their lives, are sometimes wiser for pausing. A few nervous chuckles escaped. There is much that might be said, he went on, but this is not the place for a full account. Suffice it that Lady Margaret and I have spoken honestly to one another. We have examined our hearts. What we will do now, we will do with our eyes open, not closed. He turned slightly, facing Margaret. His expression softened. "I have asked her whether she loves me," he said. "She has answered with more courage than I deserve. I have decided that I would rather walk into an imperfect truth with her than wait my whole life for a story that exists only in songs." The rustle swept the pews again, but this time there was less shock and more curiosity, sympathy even. Margaret drew a breath. Edward nodded to her, the smallest encouragement. She turned for the first time to the rows of watching faces. "My lords, ladies, and everyone," she began. Her voice trembled on the first word, but steadied as she went on. "I stand here very aware that I have not been a model of simple, unquestioning devotion. I have been afraid. I have been foolish. I have wanted to run. Many of you may know something of that feeling, though you have never had a crown waiting at the end of the aisle." A soft ripple of uneasy laughter stirred. "I began this path for the wrong reasons," she said plainly. "To save my family, to satisfy the world. Along the way, I met the man I'm about to marry, not the prince on the coins, the man who listens when he is tired, the man who remembers the names of servants and asks after their children. I came to love that man after I had already said yes with my lips. My heart lagged behind and then struggled to catch up. That is the truth." She felt Edward's gaze on her and drew strength from it. "I have told him everything," she finished. "He has chosen to forgive me my beginnings. I choose in turn to stand here of my own will. If you must whisper about someone after today, whisper that." There was a strange, brief silence. Then, from somewhere near the front, a single pair of hands began to clap. It might have been Agnes. It might have been someone else entirely. A second pair joined, then a third. The sound grew, not a roar, but a warm, hesitant applause that spread through the chapel before etiquette could quite decide whether to allow it. The Queen did not clap, but she did incline her head just enough to be seen. The Archbishop, caught between scandal and relief, lifted his hands for quiet. "Your Royal Highness," he said to Edward, "Lady Margaret, shall we proceed?" Edward turned back to him, and then to Margaret. He reached for her hand. This time, when their fingers met, there was no doubt. His grip was firm, hers answering. "We shall," he said. The Archbishop took a breath of his own, visibly bracing himself. "Repeat after me," he said to Edward. "I, Edward, take thee, Margaret, to my wedded wife." Edward looked down at her, and for a moment the rest of the world receded. When he spoke, his voice was clear. "I, Edward, take thee, Margaret, to my wedded wife," he said, "to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse." He did not rush. Each phrase seemed to settle around them like a thread, binding not loosely, but with deliberate care. "For richer, for poorer," he went on. Margaret thought of ledgers and creditors, of her father's tired eyes, and felt something inside her unclench. Whatever came now, she was not selling herself to save anyone else. She was giving herself. "In sickness and in health," Edward continued, "to love and to cherish till death us do part." The words hung for a moment. He finished softly, "According to God's holy ordinance, and thereto I plight thee my troth." Margaret's eyes stung. "Now you, my child," the Archbishop said to her. "I, Margaret, take thee, Edward, to my wedded husband." She repeated the words, her voice steady. "I, Margaret, take thee, Edward, to my wedded husband," she said, letting each syllable carry the weight of what she felt. "To have and to hold from this day forward." As she spoke of better and worse, she glanced up. Edward's gaze did not waver. In richer and poorer she squeezed his hands, a small promise. In sickness and health she thought of him bent over papers long into the night and vowed silently to be the one who closed the ink bottle when he forgot. To love and to cherish, till death us do part, felt less like a distant concept and more like a simple, resolute yes. "And thereto I give thee my troth," she finished. The ring followed. Edward took it from the tiny velvet cushion held by the page. His fingers shook almost imperceptibly as he slid it onto her hand. "With this ring I thee wed," he said quietly. "With my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." He caught her eye on the last phrase, and gave the faintest shrug as if to say, "What little these worldly goods are worth, compared to what we have just done." Then it was her turn. She placed the lighter band on his finger, her hand surprisingly sure. "With this ring I thee wed," she said, "with my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." Her smile touched the words. "Such as they are." Someone in the back stifled a chuckle. The tension in the air eased. The Archbishop raised his hands. his voice regaining its familiar authority. "For as much as Edward and Margaret have consented together in holy wedlock, and have witnessed the same before God and this company, I pronounce that they be man and wife together, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen." "Amen," murmured the congregation. The world seemed to sway around Margaret, man and wife. It settled into her bones. The Archbishop leaned closer, his tone lowering to the traditional prompting. "You may seal your vows with a chaste kiss, Your Royal Highness," he said. Edward's mouth quirked, so quickly she might have imagined it. He lifted Margaret's hand, drew her a little closer. For a moment they simply looked at each other. There were no doors half open, no overheard whispers, no queens, no courtiers, only the two of them, standing where their paths had converged. "Hello, wife," he murmured, too softly for anyone else. "Hello, husband," she whispered back. He bent his head and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle, entirely proper, the kind that would offend no one and disappoint every romantic novelist. And yet, in the quiet firmness of it, there was something that made Margaret's breath catch. A promise and a question answered. The chapel exploded into sound. Applause, relieved and enthusiastic, broke out. Some of it was for the crown, some for the ceremony, but much of it, Margaret sensed, was for the fact that this strange, halted, half-scandalous marriage had ended in a visible act of unity. They turned together to face the congregation. Edward's hand remained over hers, their fingers interlaced. For the first time that day, Margaret let herself smile fully. The expression felt strange on her face, like using a muscle that had been strained and finally released. The Queen's eyes were bright. Whether with unshed tears or simple relief, Margaret could not say. Lord Ashford looked as if he might collapse from the sudden absence of tension. The Countess had a handkerchief pressed to her lips. Agnes was openly crying, dabbing at her cheeks with no regard for decorum. The organ struck up a jubilant hymn. The newly married couple turned and began the walk back down the aisle, this time not toward judgment, but toward a future neither of them could fully picture, but both were willing to face. As they passed, people bowed and curtsied. Margaret heard fragments. "Remarkable girl. Brave. To speak so. Quite improper, if you ask me." Improper. Perhaps, but honest. Edward leaned slightly toward her. "How does it feel?" he asked softly. "Like the end of a very long storm," she said. "And the start of another, perhaps gentler one." He laughed under his breath. "Let us hope there are fewer archbishops in the next storm." They reached the doors. The light beyond was dazzling after the dim chapel. As they stepped outside, a roar went up from the waiting crowds in the courtyard. Cheers, shouts, the clatter of carriage wheels. The carriage ride was a blur. People lining the route waved hats and handkerchiefs. Some shouted their names. Children perched on shoulders. Margaret waved until her wrist ached, smiling until her cheeks did. Inside the carriage, however, it was quiet. The noise outside turned to a muted background. They sat close on the narrow seat, hands still linked. The intimacy of the enclosed space, after the vast urgency of the chapel, felt almost shocking. "I thought," Margaret said at last, "that I would feel nothing but exhaustion. Instead, I feel—" She searched for the word, "light, as if a great stone has rolled away." "That is how confession is meant to work, I believe," Edward said. "You confessed as well," she reminded him. "In your own way." He nodded slowly. "It seems I needed to. I have spent years being the man people expected to see, instead of the one I am. Today I behaved badly, then tried to behave better. Perhaps that is honest, if not very majestic." She turned the ring on her finger, marveling at its weight. "I did not picture my wedding day like this when I was a child," she said. "I pictured flowers and music and graceful speeches, not letters and questions at the altar." "Would you change it?" he asked. "If you could," she thought. "I would spare you the pain," she said, "and my parents the terror. But the rest—" Her gaze met his. "No, I do not think I would change the fact that we began in truth rather than in a polished story. It may make things harder, but it makes us real." He smiled, a small private smile just for her. "Real," he repeated. "What a dangerous ambition for a prince and princess." "At least we will be dangerous together," she said. The procession ended at the great hall, transformed for the wedding breakfast. Toasts were made, some halting, some eloquent. A few speakers tried to pretend nothing unusual had happened. Others, more courageous or more foolish, made veiled references to honesty and to the admirable frankness of our new Princess of Wales, which made Margaret blush and Edward choke into his wine. At one point, the Queen drew Margaret aside to a quieter corner. "You look less terrified," Her Majesty observed. "I am less terrified," Margaret admitted. "The worst has already happened. The rest seems less frightening by comparison." The Queen's mouth softened. "You did well," she said. "And you were kinder to my son than he deserved for a few minutes there." Margaret swallowed. "He was wounded," she said. "Wounded pride makes for poor decisions. I helped cause it. I cannot blame him entirely." "You will find," the Queen said, "that marriage is not the art of never hurting one another. It is the practice of forgiving and being forgiven before the wound festers." She paused. "And of closing doors before speaking quite so freely." Margaret's cheeks flamed. "Yes, ma'am." The Queen's eyes twinkled for a moment. "Still," she added, "I am glad he listened, both at the door and afterward." Margaret hesitated. "Ma'am," she said, "may I ask you something? Were you ever afraid at the beginning?" "Terrified," the Queen replied at once, "though I did not have the courage to say so in public. You have in one morning done something it took me years to learn. You have dared to be human in the middle of a court that prefers statues." She laid a hand lightly on Margaret's cheek. "Take care of him," she said. "He will take care of you," in his own infuriating, earnest way. "Between the two of you, perhaps you will manage to drag this country a little further toward kindness." Later, Agnes cornered her near a window. "If this is what you do on a wedding day," Agnes said, eyes shining with a mix of shock and pride, "I tremble to think what you will do when you have a coronation." "Collapse quietly in a corner, I hope," Margaret said, "and let everyone else shout for once." Agnes took both her hands. "You were magnificent," she said. "Terribly alarming, but magnificent. I nearly fainted when he asked you that question. And then you answered like that. I thought you might disown me for dragging your name into such chaos," Margaret said. "I shall dine on the tale for years," Agnes retorted. "My grandchildren will tire of hearing how I watched the Princess of Wales scold half the court by example." They both laughed, the tension finally breaking into something light. The day blurred on. More toasts, endless congratulations, formalities. Eventually, blessedly, the festivities wound down. Guests departed in carriages. The castle quieted. At last, as evening deepened, Edward and Margaret found themselves in a smaller sitting room, a private fire crackling, the noise of the day muffled by thick walls and heavy curtains. Margaret sank onto a sofa with a sigh. "If one more person speaks of future heirs," she said, "I may take up residence in the stables." "You would be safer there," Edward agreed. "Horses gossip less than courtiers." He sat beside her, leaving a polite space. The space felt unnecessary now. She shifted closer until their shoulders brushed. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the soft pop of the fire. "How are you?" he asked eventually. "Truly. Not as a princess, but as Margaret." "Tired," she said. "Relieved. A little astonished that we are still here in one piece." "And you?" "Much the same," he said, "with the added knowledge that I am now bound for life to a woman who might at any moment tell a duchess inconvenient truths at a dinner party." "She had better mind her behavior then," Margaret said. "The woman, I mean." "Not the duchess." He turned his head to look at her. The firelight softened his features, made him look younger, almost boyish. "I was afraid this morning," he said quietly. "Afraid you would walk away. Afraid I would send you away and regret it forever. I have been given many things in my life without earning them. Today, whatever else I have done wrong, I feel I have at least not run from the hard choice. We chose each other," she said simply. "Above pride and fear, that seems a good beginning." He reached for her hand again. This time he did not merely hold it. He lifted it to his lips and pressed a lingering kiss to the back of it. The touch was reverent, almost shy. "Thank you," he said, his voice rougher than before, "for not running, for burning the letter, for telling me anyway, for loving me when it would have been easier to stay distant." Tears pricked her eyes. "Thank you," she answered, "for listening at doors you ought not have, then listening properly when it mattered, for choosing to believe that I could be more than the worst thing I have done, for asking me that question, even if I shall give you no end of scolding for the manner of it." He smiled. "I deserve it. And I shall rely on you to ask me questions in turn when I grow too comfortable in my own certainty." She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. He did not move away. Instead, she felt him exhale and relax, as if some tight band around his chest had loosened at last. Outside, the bells of Windsor rang again, this time in celebration rather than summons. The sound drifted faintly through the window. "Do you hear that?" she asked. "Yes. It sounds different," she said. "This morning they felt like a command. Now they sound like a blessing." "Perhaps they do both," he replied. "Call us, then send us. We will likely fail them in some ways. We will disappoint people. We will quarrel. We will make dreadful mistakes." "We already have," she reminded him. "True," he said. "But perhaps we will also apologize, and forgive, and try again. If we can do that, the rest may be bearable." They sat like that for a while, two tired figures in fine clothes, leaning into each other not as ornaments of the state, but as people who had survived a long, difficult day and chosen one another at the end of it. Years later, people would still speak of that wedding. They would remember the delay, the shock when the prince stopped the ceremony, the collective intake of breath when he asked his bride if she loved him. They would argue over the appropriateness of such honesty. Some would tut and say it had been scandalous. Others would call it brave. A few would say it had been necessary. What most of them would remember, though, if pressed, was the look that passed between the couple at the altar before the final vows. The way the young woman straightened her shoulders and spoke as if she were in a drawing room, not a cathedral. The way the prince's expression changed when he heard her answer, pride and humility warring and then settling together. In time, under their shared influence, small things began to shift at court. Young men and women found themselves encouraged, quietly, to speak of their wishes before arrangements were made. The Queen surprised everyone by intervening more than once to halt a marriage founded solely on debts and desperation. It remained a world of titles and duty, but it became little by little more honest. As for Edward and Margaret, their marriage was not a tale of unbroken harmony. They argued, sometimes fiercely, about policies, about invitations, about which charities to support, about how late he worked or how blunt she had been in conversation. There were slammed doors more than once, and long walks taken in opposite directions. But there were apologies too. There were evenings spent talking by the fire long after the candles had burned low, hands entwined like anchors. There were visits to factories and schools, where they stood side by side and listened, then argued with ministers later about what they had heard. There were quiet mornings when he read state papers and she wrote letters to reformers, their feet touching under the table, each an unconscious reassurance of the other's presence. On the anniversary of their wedding, some years later, they walked again in the castle gardens. The day was softer than that first one, the air less sharp. Margaret wore no veil now, only a simple hat. Edward's uniform had been traded for a less elaborate coat. They looked to anyone watching from the windows, like any married couple taking the air. "Do you remember," Edward said, "what you said to me in the carriage that day, about storms? That I hoped the next one would have fewer archbishops," she answered promptly. "I stand by it." He laughed. "You also said you felt light. Do you still?" She considered. "Lighter," she said. "Not because life has become miraculously easy. It has not. But because I am no longer carrying secrets that do not belong to me alone. There is such weight in what we do not say." He nodded. "If I have learned anything from that day, it is that truth told early may cause a small scandal. Truth told late may nearly destroy you. I prefer the smaller scandal." "You say that now," she teased. "Wait until the next time I tell a duke his opinion is ill-informed. I shall be proud and wearily amused," he said, "and perhaps I shall pretend not to hear to spare him the embarrassment." They walked on a little farther. The sun slipped behind a cloud, then emerged again. Margaret glanced at him. "Do you ever regret asking me that question?" she asked. "At the altar?" He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said at last. "I regret the timing. I regret the hurt I caused you. But I do not regret the question. It was the moment when we stopped being actors in a pageant and became ourselves. Everything that has followed, our quarrels, our laughter, the changes we have tried to make, began there, I would rather have a marriage born in an awkward truth than in a graceful lie. She slipped her arm through his. Then we are agreed, she said. On at least one matter. On more than one, I hope, he replied. She smiled. On more than one. They walked on. Somewhere behind them, the bells of Windsor chimed the hour. The sound spread over the gardens, over the town, over fields where people who would never see the inside of a palace went about their days. Most of those people would never know the full story of what had happened at the altar years before. They would know only that their future king and queen seemed to look at each other not only as duty required, but as something quieter and stronger required too. In the end, that was the true legacy of that interrupted wedding. Not the gossip, not the shock, not the columns in the newspapers, but the simple fact that a prince and a young woman had chosen to build their life together on something rare in their world. Truth spoken even when it shook the walls. Margaret had once believed that her worth lay in saving her family with a brilliant match. Edward had once believed that his role was to carry the crown alone, at whatever cost to his own heart. On that day at the altar, both of them let those beliefs fall. They learned instead that love which survives humiliation, confession, and choice is stronger than love that never meets a test. They learned that a crown worn with an honest heart is lighter than one balanced on pretense. They learned most of all that two imperfect people who are willing to say, "I was wrong and I forgive you," may together change more than laws and customs. They may change what other hearts dare to hope. And so, whenever anyone repeated the old story, do you remember in 1874 when the Prince of Wales stopped his own wedding? The tale, in the end, did not sound like a scandal at all, but like the beginning of a marriage that was, in its own flawed, earnest way, truly worthy of the vows they had spoken. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.